In this video, we're going to talk about something which is now called scope ambiguity. This is what Russell is talking about when he talks about this difference between primary and secondary occurrence of quantifiers in the paper. Those terms, primary and secondary occurrence, they're not really used anymore. What people now refer to this is as what's called scope ambiguity, or scope distinctions. So that's the word I'm going to use. The reason why I'm dedicating an entire video to it is for two reasons. One is that it's kind of necessary to understand what Russell is talking about here, to understand how he tries to solve some of the puzzles that we are talking about in previous videos. So to understand what happens in the next video, you gotta know something about scope. The other reason we're talking about scope, though, is because scope is going to become more and more important in the weeks to come. In about 2 weeks' time, we're going to talk about Kripke on names. It's going to be a reference to what's called the Frege-Russell theory of names. That's what we're going to talk about next week. And a lot of Kripke's arguments are based on this notion of scope. So getting a solid grip on it this week is going to help us understand what happens in the weeks to come. So when we say that a sentence is ambiguous, what we mean is that it gives rise to at least two meanings. Or to put it slightly differently, as people nowadays say, there are two ways of reading the sentence. I'll refer to readings as different particular meanings. So if I use the word reading, that's a quick way of saying a particular way of understanding the sentence. And to say that a sentence has a scope ambiguity is to say that there are two different ways of understanding the sentence because of the particular kinds of operators involved and the way that they might be put together. And one of the most important kinds of expressions which gives rise to scope ambiguities are quantifiers. So to get a sense of what's involved in a scope ambiguity, the easiest thing to do is to just think about a particular example and see that it gives rise to multiple readings. So take this sentence I have on the board. Alice knows some student at TTU is Tom Cruise's daughter. I'm going to now give you some quick arguments that actually this sentence is ambiguous. There's more than one way to understand what this might be saying. And to do that, we can imagine two very different kinds of situations in which the sentence might be true. The first meaning is probably the more obvious one, where Alice may not in particular know who the student is, but she knows that there is some student at TTU who's Tom Cruise's daughter. So we can imagine she might know this because she's opened the student newspaper, she reads this story that Tom Cruise's daughter is coming to TTU. Maybe we'll imagine the story, for privacy reasons, doesn't actually report the name of Tom Cruise's daughter. So Alice doesn't know exactly who that person is, but she does know that there is somebody attending the university who's Tom Cruise's daughter. So that's one way, and probably the most natural way to understand it, or probably the first kind of way to understand the sentence that might come to your mind. But there is actually a second way to understand the sentence as well. Now it's a bit harder to hear and it requires a little bit more work, but I think when we find the right situation, you can see that there is this distinct meaning. So we need a little bit more of a complicated situation here. But imagine something like this happens. So Alice meets this other person, Carol, and Carol tells Alice that she's Tom Cruise's daughter. But Carol doesn't tell Alice that she's a student at TTU. Maybe Alice also isn't a student at TTU. So Alice doesn't know that Carol is a student. She has no reason to think that she's a student. But now let's imagine Alice comes along to me and she says, oh, I met this person, Carol. Turns out Carol is Tom Cruise's daughter. Now, I know exactly who Carol is. Let's imagine I know that Carol is, in fact, a student at TTU. And imagine I want to tell you that Alice knows or met the person who is Tom Cruise's daughter, but I don't want to give away their identity. I don't want to give away to you that the identity of Tom Cruise's daughter is Carol. In that situation, I might say something like, well, Alice knows that some student at TTU is Tom Cruise's daughter. And what I'm saying is that, well, there's a particular person that Alice knows is Tom Cruise's daughter, and that person happens to be a student at TTU. And on that way of understanding the sentence, Alice herself need not be actually thinking that Carol is a TTU student. She just has to be thinking about Carol. And this quantifier is just the way that I'm choosing to pick out Carol and talking to you because I don't want to give away Carol's identity. So there are two different ways of understanding a sentence like this. One where Alice has no particular person in mind. She's just thinking, well, there's some person who happens to be a student at TTU, who's Tom Cruise's daughter. She doesn't know who that person is. She can't think about them individually. And there's another way of understanding the sentence where she has a particular person in mind, and that person, in actual fact, happens to be a student at TTU. But she may or may not know that herself. It just is that the person that she actually happens to know this about, it can be picked out by the quantifier in this way. So the sentence is ambiguous. On one way of understanding it, Alice isn't thinking about any particular person. She's just thinking about some person who's a student and is also Tom Cruise's daughter. On the other way of thinking about it, there's some particular person she's thinking about, and that person happens to be a student, though Alice may not know that. This is exactly an example of what we're calling a scope ambiguity. There's two different ways of understanding it. And the reason why people call it a scope ambiguity is because intuitively it seems like it has something to do with the kind of order in which we're understanding these two expressions to come. Let's think about the understanding where Alice is thinking about a particular person. Another, and perhaps a slightly more clear way of saying that would be to say, well, there's some student at TTU who Alice knows is Tom Cruise's daughter. Let me write that down. There's some student at TTU who Alice knows is Tom Cruise's daughter. Unlike our original sentence, this paraphrase of one of the meanings, this isn't ambiguous. It's clear here that there's a particular person that Alice has in mind, and they happen to be a student of TTU. And the way we get this meaning, the way we say this meaning most clearly, is by putting this part about the student out front, saying that bit first. So one way to think about the different meanings of this sentence is, well, there's one meaning where we interpret the words in the order they actually come. So Alice is just, in the first case, having a thought that there is some student. But there's another way of understanding it, where it's as if we were taking this bit and putting it out front. Where as if the way we were understanding it was we were interpreting this bit first and then this bit second. In particular, we were thinking there's some student at TTU who Alice knows is Tom Cruise's daughter. So here the student bit comes first, the Alice knows bit comes second. So it seems like the reason why there are two different meanings here is because there is kind of some flexibility in which of these two things we interpret as coming first. One reading, Alice knows, is interpreted as coming first. On the other reading, the some student bit is interpreted as coming first. And this is basically why this is now called a scope distinction. We say that the quantifier takes narrow scope with respect to Alice knows when it's interpreted as coming after Alice knows. On the other hand, we would say it's interpreted with wide scope to Alice knows when we get this reading of the sentence, where it is as if we are understanding the some student bit as coming first and the Alice knows bit as coming second. So the ambiguity here seems to have something to do with the way that we can understand the structure of the sentence. We can kind of, with enough work, understand the sentence as if this bit came first rather than second. So this idea of scope, it's really just another way of thinking about some flexibility in the order of interpretation of the quantifier and the additive verb, the knows bit. Now, for our purposes today, I said the main reason for introducing scope is because it helps us understand how Russell uses his theory to solve some of the puzzles that we started with. But it's also worth mentioning in passing that this idea of scope, and once we spot that quantifiers give rise to this thing, which we're calling scope ambiguity, actually gives us some more evidence for Russell's theory. Because while we've seen that quantifiers give rise to scope ambiguity, there's this flexibility in the order in which we might interpret them with respect to other expressions. Russell is saying that a description is a certain kind of quantifier. So you might think that, well, just like quantifiers like some student at TTU gives rise to this thing we're calling scope ambiguity, you might wonder, well, do descriptions also give rise to scope ambiguity? Could we have replaced some student at TTU with a description and gotten a similar kind of ambiguity in the sentence? And in fact, the answer is yes. Descriptions do give rise to exactly the same kind of ambiguity. And this is an important reason for thinking that maybe Russell was right, for thinking maybe descriptions really are quantifiers, because they give rise to some of the same behavior as quantifiers. So to see this, we'll think about a particular example. So let's focus on this sentence. John thinks the professor is an idiot. Let's focus on that sentence. And here the claim is that just like with the previous sentence, we can get a scope ambiguity here as well, because there are two different ways of understanding the sentence. Again, it takes a little bit of work to see that, but it does really seem like there are two different ways of understanding it. The first is the obvious way, where John is just thinking, well, this guy, the professor, whoever he is, he's an idiot. So we can get this reading, we can hear this way of understanding the sentence by, imagine that John has not yet even gone to class yet, it's before the first day, but he's on the Blackboard site, he sees the syllabus, it's completely misspelled, the lecture times are wrong, it's not even the right, it's the syllabus for the wrong class, it's just completely all over the place. So here John doesn't exactly know who the professor is. When he tries to think about the professor, he doesn't have a particular person in mind because he hasn't met them yet. But he can still think something like, well, the professor, whoever that guy is an idiot. And that's what we would be communicating on the first reading of this. And again, this is what we would call the narrow scope reading of the description, where really the expression, when we're interpreting it, we put John thinks first and the professor second. So here, John doesn't have to have a particular person in mind. He doesn't need to know who the professor is. He can just say, well, the professor, whoever he is an idiot. And we could express his state of mind by saying, John thinks the professor is an idiot. But we can also get another reading in the same way, where the sentence says something about John, where he's thinking about a particular person who, in actuality, is the professor. And again, John may or may not know that, but what's important is that he's thinking about a particular person who happens to be the professor. So imagine a very different situation where everybody's in the cafeteria and John can see that there's this guy who is doing something really stupid, like maybe he's trying to fill up his cup at the soda fountain, but he's making a complete mess of it, he's spilling soda everywhere, he gets to the cash register, he doesn't know how to pay for anything. So imagine John is just looking at this guy, thinking, well, that guy is an idiot. But as a matter of fact, the guy happens to be the professor. So John is thinking about a particular person who he can see over there. He doesn't know he's the professor, but maybe we know he's the professor. And I say to you, well, clearly John thinks the professor is an idiot. There, what I'm doing is I'm not saying that John is thinking the professor, whoever he is an idiot. Rather, I'm saying that John is thinking about that guy over there in particular, thinking that he is an idiot, and that guy happens to be the professor. So just like before, another way of saying that, it's not natural English in the same way, but the professor is such that John thinks he's an idiot. Because the guy who actually happens to be the professor is the guy that John thinks is an idiot. John may or may not know he's the professor. In this situation, he doesn't. But that's the guy who he's thinking of. The guy who actually happens to be the professor. So this is just one example, but if you take descriptions in general, definite descriptions, in general, you're always going to be able to come up with this kind of ambiguity. Take any sentence involving a definite description and something like John thinks, or John knows, or Alice believes, or Alice said, or something like that. And you'll be able to come up with an example of scope ambiguity, where intuitively there is some slippage in whether you interpret the description as coming second or interpret the description as coming first. Either way of understanding the sentence is possible. And this is kind of an important piece of evidence for Russell's claim, because remember what I said in the very first video. Russell is trying to argue that, despite appearances, descriptions really are quantifiers. And noticing that descriptions give rise to these, what we're calling scope ambiguities, is a very important piece of evidence for Russell's view. So it's not just that. So the primary argument is going to be that it solves all these problems that we talked about in the puzzles video. But another important argument for thinking that Russell is onto something is that, well, we first showed that quantifiers give rise to this thing called scope ambiguity. And then when we looked at definite descriptions, we saw that they seem to do the same thing. So that is an important piece of evidence for thinking that maybe really Russell is right, that descriptions are a kind of quantifier and not just a way of referring to somebody.